welcome again. Thanks for watching the podcast. And this week we're with Lena Swedlow. So Lena works for the think tank Compass, which is based down south. But we came across Lena some years back when she was a sort of intern with Commonweal, and I was at a meeting where she spoke, and I just thought, wow, what an impressive young woman. She was an undergraduate over at Edinburgh University at the time. And out of that, there was an interview that went out on Independence Live. But then we saw her again more recently at earlier this year, didn't we?
It was in April, and it was at a conference organised by the Electoral Reform Society, and it was called A Scottish Spring. Very, very interesting, looking at democracy in Scotland and how it works. But Lena had the last speech of the day, and for us, the best speech of the day. But unfortunately, we didn't manage to record it. So we'd said right then, we must get her on the show. And I think you'll enjoy the conversation that follows. It goes over a lot of different topics. And what I really liked about our discussion with Lena, she was very good, I thought, at taking our positions and broadening them out.
Yeah.
You know, we would say something like, look how terrible reform is. But what about the people? What are they thinking? Making the conversation broader than perhaps we'd set it up as.
I think that's a very pertinent remark, actually. She sort of broadened it out, and she kind of made you think more deeply about what you just said. And if you've got someone that can do that, that's really valuable. And also, it's just nice talking to someone who's at least 2 generations younger than we are.
Yeah, it was a really interesting discussion. So let's get into it.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me on.
The last time we spoke to you was at the Scottish Spring Conference, which, I don't know, seems a long time ago now, that conference.
I mean, end of April, but in political years, probably about 4. I don't know.
Yes, exactly. It seems like a very different world since then. But I mean, one of the reasons we were keen to get you on was because your speech was actually the speech of the day.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Which is saying something, actually, because the speeches, they were very good.
Yeah, you followed Mark Drakeford, who was excellent.
He was amazing,
He was really good. But unfortunately, because it was quite a long day, both of our recording devices were out of juice by the time you came on the stage.
You had to be there. You had to be in the room.
That's
what you keep telling me about.
Yes.
I think the big point of it was to leave people on a sense of hope, right? And that what we had done was gathered and begun something that was a process of trying to parse through and build over, even if not through, like the constitutional binary that we seem to have found ourselves in Scotland in politics, that seem to have kind of stuck national debate in Scotland. And I was thinking about what hope meant to me and why I was hopeful, and the people that made me feel that way and the events that made me feel that way. And I think one of the things to say is one of those events was the 26th of April, and kudos to the organisers and to ERS Scotland for putting it on. I was one of the 16-year-olds that was given the vote in the independence referendum. And I tell the story all the time now because I work on democratic reform and why people are cut out of politics and voting. But I went along to one of the town halls that they had put on for specifically, I think, 16 and 17-year-olds, but certainly young voters. I wasn't a particularly confident kid. I wasn't particularly keen on standing up, but this question, it kind of just seemed really important. It was about whether I was going to be able to afford uni and my parents' jobs, and I'm not Scottish by birth, but I've lived in Scotland since I was 8 months old, so it was kind of like the question of who is Scottish.
That's definitely being Scottish if you've lived here.
I mean, listen to me, right? But I don't have the paperwork, so that was part of it. And I did my research, and I tried to ask a question, and I stood up, asked my question, and the guy that was on the stage kind of came back and said, "Oh, well, you're very well informed, aren't you? Where'd you get all this information? Let's not worry about all that, just sit down so we can move on." And that was the kind of reception I got from, people that were at the front of the room, that were supposed to be informative, that were supposed to be engaging, that were supposed to be bringing people into this debate. And then I kind of thought about all of the things that were hopeful about the independence moment in 2014 and that discussion. And it was because there was a genuine asking of a question about what was feasible and what was possible and what was desirable. And I think that lots and lots of people remember that time as this serious considering of like what could be, and rather than what was probable or what was likely. And that's, I think, a lot of where I started with that speech. I don't know, I think that really resonates with people because most people have been shut out or watched other people been shut out of formal politics and political parties, and certainly we've all sat in a political meeting that, you know, maybe didn't feel as welcoming as we
I mean, it's interesting your memory of that as being, you know, so positive and asking a question that we hadn't asked ourselves before, and that's my memory of it as well. And I just think it was a brilliant time, and I must say, I think not necessarily no voters themselves, but the people who were part of the politicians who were part of that Better Together No campaign. I get so annoyed when they characterise that time as being divisive, and you still hear it. You still sort of say, "Oh, we don't want another divisive referendum." Starmer said it not that long ago, actually, and it just was so not my experience, nor friends of mine. I'm not saying no one felt like that. There must have been some people that felt like that, but on the whole. So
I think what that speaks to is maybe not that particular moment, because I think the independence movement as a whole and at its best was often an ecosystem of competing ideas about exactly that. You know, what was possible, what was feasible, what was desirable, what did we really want? And that was its strength, as you say, like that was what was magic about that moment. But the 10 years since haven't seen that continue. And I think what I've learned since, and part of the reason I don't work in Scotland anymore, I think, is because the constriction of that space to consider what is possible has really come down in quite a divisive way, you know, even if 2014 as a moment itself didn't feel that way.
Could you say a bit more about that? Because I listened to you say that, and I'm not disbelieving you, not for a minute, but but it doesn't make sense to me that I can't quite see why there's been a restriction. But
I think a lot of it was, to my mind, the involvement of political parties and political party structures. So once you get into kind of away from what felt like, as you say, that conversation on the bus, or mine were often conversation on trains, and conversations and marches and things like that, you know, those spaces still do exist, but a lot of the independence movement and conversation, it seemed to me, was moved into a more like formal political space and taken over by political parties. And that sometimes was less open to, you know, principled disagreement and thinking about things seriously with the idea of like what is possible for Scotland.
I get that. I get what you mean there. But just reflecting, just when you introduced yourself there as you were 16 in 2014, you're the third person we've interviewed who was 16 in 2014. So it's like the class of 2014 has graduated and gone on to do things that we're now interested 10 years later in talking to them about. So even that sort of flowering of political consciousness and engagement.
One of them was the young lad who's now with the Scottish Socialist Party, isn't he?
Yeah, Liam.
Who's the other one?
Was the Anthony Carroll who we spoke to.
Of course, Anthony Carroll. He's now a Glasgow councillor, Lena. He's a Green Party councillor. So now you're working with Compass. How did that move happen?
Partly it was, Compass is deeply concerned with the culture and the process of how we do politics, and is committed to this idea that we don't necessarily have all the answers, but we do have a process and we do have people. It's kind of a hard organisation to always explain, but we sometimes describe it as a mad experiment of being nice. Just trying to have a nice version of politics.
Well, that'll never catch on.
We're trying. Guys. Yeah, we're doing really well. I don't know if you can tell. It's very nice right now. But I think their route was this movement through the Labour Party and then opening up into other parties, you know, all progressives of any stripe and colour. And I think that kind of questioning culture, but also deep commitment to pluralism, the idea that one person or voice or organisation or party is never enough to bring about the kind of change that we want to see. It's not nuanced enough, it can't be loud enough, and that we need each other, and we need dialogue, and we need depth and diversity and disagreement and competition and all of those things to actually bring about some of the change that we want to see. I think that really sold me on it.
That's interesting, because it sounds like, given what you said a minute ago about, you know, political parties being restrictive compared to the Yes movement, but that sounds like you've found a place for yourself. You know, that obviously it is an organisation. I mean, it's a think tank, but it's an organisation and a space that's kind of a little bit similar to that Yes movement. You've got engaged people trying to make things happen and bring them about.
Yeah, and it's that negotiation of, okay, well, what do we actually want to do, and trying to figure that out together, rather than, okay, well, you're wearing the right colour rosette, so I'll follow you into anything. You know, it's a very different kind of approach. And I came from, as you said, like Commonweal and youth climate organising and trying to work with young people and figure out where the gaps were, but also just figuring out, you know, how do you actually campaign and how do you build change movements that can make impact and sustain change and build people up.
So it's a really interesting time for your organisation, and the fact that we've got Corbyn and a party, and we've got Labour and, you know, turning into Reform. How do you manage that dynamic?
There are people in the Labour Party, the large majority of the membership, I would argue a large majority of the councillors, the mayors, and arguably also the people in Parliament, who broadly have the same values and want to see, you know, they don't want to see the two-child benefit cap continued, and they don't want to see the genocide in Gaza continue. And so how do you bring those people with you and, you know, use the power that they have? I think that's not a vehicle that we are done with as campaigners, but it doesn't mean that the new leadership in the Green Party or your party or any of the other things that are happening around the British left aren't also exciting vehicles that we want to get involved in, and we want to tap into that network and energy and see how we can bring the kind of pluralism and values and networks that we have to that as well. So I think that's... I don't know how that sits with you both.
If the Labour Party is really still, you know, supportive of, in the way you said, like getting rid of the two-child cap, which up here, I mean, I'm sure you know, up here, a Scottish government has put money to mitigate against that. I mean, the Scottish government puts a hell of a lot of money every year out of its budget to mitigate what in the past have been Tory party policies, but now, you know, they're Labour policies. So if it's right that there's still that weight of let's say left-leaning preferences within, you know, how is it that these people don't just kind of vote against it? Because they don't, do they? They get their traipse through the Commons voting system and they vote for it all. And I mean, how does that happen within a party? I mean, I voted Labour for decades.
Yeah, me too.
I couldn't, if I was in England, I couldn't vote for them. Well, I probably would have voted for them last year, but now you think, how has that happened? Where has that come from? And
I guess if it's anything, it's a provocation, right? Which is, how do you organise that chunk to give it the protection it needs from the machine, from the core of people at the top of the Labour Party right now, who want to, as we saw over the summer, you know, suspend the whip and take their jobs away from them. And how do you build up the power in the membership, and also, as I say, the councillors and the mayors and the MPs that want to do that, and give them that. And that's exactly why yesterday Compass has launched with our friends in Open Labour and our Labour networks, Mainstream, which is a network of Labour activists trying to pull Labour back into a place where, you know, people can, as you say, Marlene, like, conceive of tactically voting for them in a situation where they feel like they have to. Because I feel like what we're hearing right now is, I mean, it's 4 years down the line, and who knows what's going to happen if we've just said, 4 political years have happened since April. It feels silly to be guessing, but it looks like what the tactic is, let a Reform Party build up that's, really strong and is a genuine threat and is a genuine chance at being, Nigel Farage has a genuine chance of being Prime Minister, and say, well, you got to vote for us instead. And the gamble is, that most progressive voters or voters who tend to fall on centre-left grounds will vote for them.
That's a very dangerous gamble,
We perceive Reform in particular as just liars a lot of the time. I mean, when they say anything at all about their policies, it's hideous stuff. And when they make promises, they're fictional nonsense. So how does democracy operate in that kind of context? And I see your thinking there about Labour are going to point them and say, well, they're even worse than us. Which one do you want? Do you want bad or badder? But if one side is not even pretending to stick to the truth, is that a fair fight? How does democracy work in that scenario?
It's a good question. I think, if I'm not wrong, you're kind of focusing on the behaviours of particularly the leader, and particularly their MPs and their kind of headpiece people at the top of the party there, right?
You mean the top of Reform or the top of Reform? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Well, the collection of misfits and conspiracy theorists hanging on the coattails is quite horrifying to behold. But yes, I suppose it is.
But I think, there's also a significant chunk of the UK population that's now considering supporting them because of all of the dice in their direction is, in their eyes, more what they want to see than the current establishment parties. And last polling I saw had about 20% of the Labour vote in Scotland from 2024 going to Reform. So these are not all conspiracy theorists. So I think it's very real that this is a significant chunk of the population.
I shared something on Blue Sky the other day. It was Maximilian Robespierre, does a YouTube channel. He's very good. And he had a little piece, and somebody had gone to Clacton and interviewed a whole selection of Reform supporting voters.
Do you agree that everyone should have the right to a fair trial?
Yes. Yes, of course.
Yes. Yeah. Goes without saying, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes, of course, yeah. Hands on the crime, yes.
The right to freedom of speech and expression?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes, of course, yes. Definitely. 100%.
Yeah.
Yes.
The right to an education?
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
The right to be free from torture?
Yes. Yes, of course.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. All of those above, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, of course, yes.
Nigel Farage proposed scrapping the Human Rights Act to make it easier to deport migrants. We've come to Clacton to see what his constituents think of it. Were you aware that all of those rights are given to us by the Human Rights Act?
Right.
And a certain politician, maybe you could guess, and said that he wanted to tear up that legislation. Right. Do you have any idea who it might be?
What, our government now, is it?
It's Nigel Farage, your MP.
Really?
Yeah, are you a bit surprised by that?
I think the rights in those who come over here, they need to earn the rights. Yeah.
So you supported the idea of human rights, but as soon as we inject immigration into it, as soon as we say, well, Nigel Farage wants to tear them up, then we need to have two sets of rights. So rights for British people and a separate set of rights for everyone else. That's not how human rights work. There aren't two groups of humans, okay?
These are perhaps people with not much political nous. They all, I think, had voted for him in the election, but maybe without really looking at what were they voting for. And when you just lift the lid on, well, do you agree with this, and this, and this that he espouses? No, they don't. And yet they're going to be sucked into that. So whilst I agree there will be some people voting for him because they absolutely agree with what they hate immigrants, they desperately think women should be seen and not heard, everything that he says they agree with. But I do think there's a lot of people who just haven't paid that much attention, who are getting swept up with it, because that's exactly what happened with Trump and MAGA and everything in America. You know, they seem to get bowled along in this because they've got problems and somebody offers them an answer. So, oh, yes, I'll have that. But when you look below the lid, you think, how could they possibly ever have thought that was going to happen?
I think that my interpretation, or I guess my answer to that, Fiona, would be that reform is less about the offer, and the appeal of reform seems to me to be less about what they're an alternative to and what they're proposing to do politically, and more of a vent. Polling consistently shows that their support is driven by agreement. You know, it's not driven by ideology. It's not driven by agreement that we should cut taxes and deregulate everything and have a tiny, tiny state, and, you know, all of the things that they're proposing, as you say. It's driven by this deep disillusionment that our mainstream political parties and their leaders have been complicit in signing away our rights and our money and our future, and now, you know, our data and any other thing that we can find as a commodity to the highest bidder, you know, sometimes not even the highest bidder. And I think that frustration is simmering and has been simmering away, and you now have this really archaic voting system and political system that is dealing pretty badly with that fragmentation, and, you know, filtering it through a really right-wing press, and nobody feels represented by Westminster. Nobody really feels represented by Holyrood, certainly not that I know. So I think, you know, there's that distance between power that people innately feel, and this is an expression of that. And Trump, I mean, the US political system is a little different. But it has similar dynamics, and I think
the playbook is the same. The way they're both approaching the
and that dynamic could be challenged by the entrance of genuinely new anti-establishment parties. If your party managed that ahead of 2026, I don't know what that will look like in the Scottish Parliament, and I don't know if the Greens or Zach Polanski in England might start to take that turn as well. But currently, from polling, those two parties really aren't touching that voting bloc. So I think there's this anti-establishment feeling that we really have to come to terms with, because people are angry, and I think that, like,
I think that's true. For all the reasons that you just mentioned, and one that you didn't mention, which was economic inequality now. It's so the difference between a highly paid job and someone who's you know, got an ordinary job, but actually their wages have hardly gone up in terms of cost of living, hardly gone up for years and years and years, if not longer than that. I mean, that sort of inequality, so therefore you end up, you don't have much in the way of disposable income, you're always kind of, the rents go up, all those things push people into cynicism, I think. And like, who's looking after us? Who's going to do anything about that? To which actually the answer used to be the Labour Party. But so there's that happening. There's all the things you said, plus the inequality, economic inequality. And also, I saw a guy, he was coming out of the Reform UK conference that's just happened. And, you know, he was a big guy, actually, quite jovial. And, you know, BBC reporter sort of pretty well asked him, look, what brought you to, you know, reform? His reply was, well, it's been great, this weekend's been great, and there's such a sense of energy and engagement, and people want to do things, and it's just brilliant, and I haven't had that for ages. And I thought, that's what I thought in 2014 with the referendum. But, you know, he was down in England, so he hasn't had that experience. And I think there's a lot of that, and maybe that does actually just connect back to what you said a while ago about, you know, political parties, for whatever reasons, are tending not to pull people in that kind of come and join us, come and make a difference, tell us what you want kind of way. I mean, I was quite taken with it. You know, it's easy to I think it's actually accurate to characterise Nigel Farage and some of the people in Reform as racist. It wouldn't be fair to say that of everybody, in who's joined Reform. And
I don't know. There is this, like, who do we demonise? Who do we blame? Who's the bad guy, right? And I think I want to be clear. You're right, Marlene. There is, a question about the role of economic inequality and structural and generational economic inequality in pushing this. But there's also a real stoked, latent, intentional anti-multiculturalism and racist undertone to a lot of our narratives, and specifically Islamophobic in the UK, and that has been true and getting worse arguably for a few years. And Hope Not Hate has done some great work tracking the ways that different feelings of anti-multiculturalism have grown and changed over the last 5 years and 10 years. But I do think that there is a really important piece in that drive that often gets left out. A lot particularly after the riots last year, we had this immediate material analysis that, like, people's circumstances were difficult and they had faced inequality, and it's like, well, these people have agency. I think that in some ways that's kind of condescending, right? Like, there's a definite part of Reform's voter base that is quite libertarian and is quite well off and is kind of an old Tory voter. So there's more complex things going on here. And a lot of that, to me, is this question about power, is this question about alienation from a sense of, I can do things in my community that make a difference. And whether that's voting every 4 years, often not, most people's votes don't count, or whether that's any sense of connection to power. I think that's, a really important part of this. The other thing I'd say is, just on this, like, a lot of people right now and a lot of people, I think, over the past 2 years, but especially since Starmer's been in power, have brought up this point of political vision and political strategy and, like, what is it that he stands for, and that kind of common phrase that you hear. But I think, to me, one of the key parts of this is, like, the UK that I want to see and the Scotland that I want to see is one where we do have social services that work, and we do decarbonise, and we do have a thriving art and music scene that isn't 95% privately educated rich kids. We do have, a social security net that facilitates that people who can't work live in dignity. And I don't see that articulation anywhere, and this isn't to say that, the Labour Party is the only place for that, and it could be springing up in the Greens and your party, but it's just, Farage has very effectively communicated the kind of Britain he wants to see, and people we see raising flags to that, right?
It's I think that's absolutely true. It's horrifying, but it's true. The other thing that's chilling me just now is this narrative of, we have to have more and more defences, we have to have more and more armour, we have to have more and more munition. I don't know if you follow Scottish politics, but Kate Forbes, the Deputy First Minister, actually being happy about this, because, oh, great, we'll get some economic growth. I think, really? Is that what we aspire to? I mean, that just seems to be a particular Starmer thing, that he seems to be hanging a lot of his, I don't know, his how he's seen to the foreign leaders of the world. Maybe it's aimed more at them than us. I don't know. But is that kind of thing and something that your organisation is looking at all?
It's hard not to be, concerned by that kind of narrative. To come back to mainstream, there was a long discussion about what is our position on foreign policy, what's our position on Gaza, what's our position on these things. And I think ultimately we've set out a founding statement that has values in it that says we stand for human rights and dignity and defend liberty and protest and social protection at home and abroad and all of those things. But ultimately, we want these things to be decided by our members. So I think that there's a question of who decides those particular positions. But the other thing I'd say is that one of the lovely parts of the earlier meetings that the 26th of April event came out of, and that we've been talking about in that group that helped organise it, and that I picked up on the day, was the sense that, we may have focused on the constitutional binary, but there's lots and lots of binaries that we have used to frame Scottish politics for a long, long time. And this is one of them. If we get some economic growth, or if the example I leaned on was, if we look at child poverty, Scotland is often congratulated because we're doing better marginally than England. And it's like, well, why is our aspiration to do marginally better?
Yeah.
Why is our aspiration to meet these policies? Why is this the prism by which we define every bit of success and everything? And I think that there's the structural explanations for why that is, but it would be really hopeful and heartening to see a parliament come in 2026 that said, okay, actually, this is the agenda and this is how we're going to decide what it is, and it's beyond that.
You could do that if the parliament that we brought in next year was an independent Scottish government. But how can you do that to the? I mean, I don't disagree with you. I mean, I would like to see all that as well. Although I do think actually there's a reason for making comparisons between how the different parts of the UK do. I mean, actually, I think that's quite really valid and needed a lot more than it is. But if you're stuck with a devolved parliament that doesn't set its own budget, surely you're always going to be trying to catch up. Like I said earlier, all the ways in which current government mitigates policies that most of them came out of a Tory party in London, but now some of them are coming out of the Labour Party in London. So I completely agree with you, but I just think that can't happen if we're not independent.
When we were at the Danny Dorling event the other week, he too made that point that, okay, we're slightly better than England in a lot of things, but actually we're a long way short of Norway or Denmark or Ireland, and you're right, the thing that's stopping us getting there is the constitutional position. But in terms of having that as our aspiration, absolutely we should be aiming
I
for
don't
the
think there's
destiny.
any question that's our aspiration. I mean, that is the aspiration. I mean, why wouldn't it be? I mean, I'm sure it's the aspiration of a lot of Labour people up here in the Scottish Labour Party as well. Which is, why if we were independent, those currently unionist-based, Westminster-based parties, there'd be a Scottish Labour Party, there'd be a Scottish Tory Party, there'd be Scottish Lib Dems, there'd probably be loads of other folk. I mean, there's a good section of Scottish society that exactly that's what our aspirations would be. All I'm saying is a bit more pragmatic than that. There's no way you can do it if you don't control your own budget.
I've watched the last, my whole political life because of that's 2014 on.
Yeah.
The Scottish Parliament be cast as impotent, essentially, for political reasons, right? And say, well, we can't do this until we get independence. And it's like, well, there's lots and lots of things we could do that we have decided, or that someone has said that we can't do. And I think that often that's a smokescreen for, the kind of politics that is at Holyrood and wants to run that. And often it's just, I don't know, there's a question of why exactly. But I think that kind of framing has gotten us also in a lot of problems now in Scotland, where we see, well, actually we did have power over this and we haven't taken the opportunities and used all of the ways that we could have devolved power, for example, outside of Holyrood,
Sure. Yeah.
So I think, yes, but there is also a...
Yeah, I completely...
there.
I think that's true. I think it's two different things, though. I think there's the bits where you have to have a budget to do something, and if you don't set your own budget and you're not in charge of your own money, that's a real limit. But then there's the other thing, which I think you've just touched on, and I agree with this actually with Scottish Government. There's also ideas and putting forward ideas and making new things happen, and they wouldn't necessarily need loads and loads of hundreds of millions of quid. But so one of them would be like land reform. That just needs more guts from Scottish politicians to sort of say to big landowners, we've heard you, we don't agree, we're not doing there, we're going to change it. If you don't like it, get out. And that kind of thing, I completely agree. Actually, that's a big example of it. I mean, I'm sure there's other ones. Well, there could have been more power devolved to local authorities as well. Actually,
Yeah,
for sure.
and that hasn't happened.
And I think, if you look at the areas where that's making progress, I mean, say arguably land reform, that's a really big issue, and rent controls. These are because people have campaigned on them, right? Like living rent. One of the examples of I think, really amazing things happening right now is the RS of Scotland's citizens' assemblies that are happening in Dunfermline. There are these ideas, but they aren't coming from government, and they're often not helped. They're kind of like, either ignored until they're big enough, and then maybe. And I think it's, if all of the ideas are coming from elsewhere, then what is going on?
Isn't that a good thing if it comes up from the pressure of the people? I mean, just last weekend we were in Edinburgh. There was I think 5 different events on, various protests against various things, and it seemed to me that was, people out in the street. That is your absolute basic democracy. People going, I want this, I don't want that. There was a silent vigil for Gaza in Edinburgh, and there was the same thing happened in London. In London, the reporting of the police attitude was extreme. They just stormed in there after a few minutes, started arresting. I think 800 people were arrested for supporting a prescribed organisation. Whereas in Edinburgh, the police watched it. There was no attempt to intervene at all. The event happened peacefully. People made their point and off they went. Now, they may well follow it up later and pick off a few people, I don't know. But it just seems that that's an area that I think, my opinion, is that the Labour government at Westminster has completely abused the terror laws, and that the way they're applying that policy is heavy-handed and is shutting people down on free speech and the right to protest and everything. It's appalling. And yet it's the same law that we're having to grapple with in Scotland. But I think the people in Scotland would be less forgiving of the Police Scotland if they took the same approach. And actually, a lot of the narrative has been trying to, or discuss with rather than persuade, the Lord Advocate to not even take these kind of things to court at all.
Yeah, obviously it's heartbreaking to watch hundreds of people be carted away every weekend, right? And that, I imagine, will continue for how long down here, I don't know. But that is, every weekend now you're like, well, am I going to go to the protest? Am I going to get arrested? Like, what's going to happen? And that's what you're dealing with. And I think that, I wouldn't agree with you at all. Like, the idea that this is happening under the Labour Party is and is felt by many people as a betrayal of the values of free speech and liberty. And this was the party that brought in the Equalities Act.
Yes, the party
and ended Section 28, and then we can't. So many people have put their whole life into that. I think that, I guess, the way that democracy comes into this is, to me, the number of people that I interact with who are now completely politically lost, in England, there hasn't been this reckoning with Labour already that I think we had in Scotland, where there was a collapse in support and there was another vehicle, and the SNP's got its own internal party democracy and issues and baggage. But that hasn't happened here in the same way. It happened in a different way with Corbyn and some of the other parties. But I think
Lib Dems.
But there's just this reckoning that I think a lot of people will never come back to the Labour Party in its current form without, some serious changes in leadership and the people at the top that will ever, change in some people's hearts. The other thing I say in Scotland is, you do have a First Minister who will call what is happening a genocide, and who will suspend, arms licenses, and that is a very different. Campaigners are rightly pointing out still inconsistencies in their support for Israeli companies and things like that. But you have a very different frame.
And that was very much pushed by the Greens, I have to say. I think that it was their amendment that had an awful lot more in it than was first offered by the Scottish government. But it was,
it was accepted, wasn't it? That you mean accepted. The one about not
boycott and divestment and everything?
Yeah, public money on it. Yeah.
To go back to that point of Labour support going to reform, as I say, about 20% of that in Scotland, 20% of the 2024 support for Labour vote is going to reform currently. Only 5% of the SNP vote is. Now, obviously, 2024, the most loyal vote showing up only, so it's hard to draw too much from that for the SNP. But the Labour-held constituencies in Scotland are really vulnerable.
If Corbyn gets himself organised in time for Holyrood, that may well pull more Labour voters. I mean, if I was a Labour voter, I'd be much more inclined to go for Corbyn than Lena Swedlow, that's for sure. But that's another unknown right now. Again, that point you made about 4 years has happened since the spring conference is absolutely right, because none of these things really were on our horizon.
Yeah,
we were aware of reform. We didn't know anything about your party. And it just suddenly, that has changed the whole political landscape going into the next, well, certainly the Holyrood election maybe, but definitely the Westminster one.
It is, and I mean, it is good that we've got a proportional voting system for Holyrood. I mean, that's great. I mean, I wish it wasn't quite the one we've got, but anyway, that's what we've got. And it does produce a parliament that pretty accurately reflects how people cast their votes over the two votes that we all have. So when Fiona and I were at this event in Holyrood in the debating chamber at Festival of Politics, we went to listen to Danny Dorling, and we went, we'll go down the front. We ended up in the Tory party front benches. That's where we were sitting, which was quite funny actually in some ways, But we do end up with a parliament that does reflect how we vote, and that means that next year there will be Reform UK MSPs. That's going to happen. Hopefully.
Well, there's one there now.
Oh, that's true. They've converted, but a former Tory. But people who've actually been elected as Reform UK, and well, in one way it's good because it's proportional representation, and there you go. Another way I kind of find it kind of horrifying, and it's going to make Holyrood much more complex, I think. I mean, I although the voting looks pretty good at the moment for the SNP, that can change really quickly. So if you end up with, a bunch of, there'll be fewer Tories, but there'll be a Reform. There might be fewer Labour, but then there might be some your party people, and it just makes things so complicated, doesn't it?
Yes. I guess there's two things. One is, this point about the proportional system, and I think what you were getting at there, Marlene, is that first past the post maybe doesn't let these people in, and that would be a good thing, right?
Well, I don't really think that, but yes. Well, no, I do sometimes think that, but then I think, no, I don't really think that,
and I think it's an emotional reaction, right? Because it's like, well, these people are really troubling, but I think what hasn't maybe been metabolized in the same way in the UK, and I don't know if this is true. My instinct is that this idea that like somehow the parties that have seats have power, and they might have a platform, but I would argue Reform already has a pretty big platform.
It's called the BBC.
Yeah,
the sense that actually the price of having a seat at the table of power and having a seat and trying to decide things is sharing it, and you have to share it with other people. I think is a core part of proportional systems that does make them more resilient to dealing with the populist right. If you think about the way that just arguably a bad example, but Trump has managed to have unfettered access to the state, and the same thing would happen here. If you have a majority, you have a majority. Whereas Maloney or Wilders or any of these other populist right leaders have had to contend with the kind of cultures and processes and structures of a proportional system.
Yeah,
it's a little different.
It pulls people in from the extremes because they have to find areas where they have consensus in order to move forward. So I think that actually is a really positive thing. It's collaboration and consensus is much harder to achieve, but it's much better at the end. It's more stable.
The British state has particular dynamics, but I think that part of the frustration that we were talking about earlier, you know, and a very particular history, is this sense that, like, we're just stuck, like nothing's happening. And in those systems, you do get some like really horrific figures, or people who I think have horrific views, and I would say are extremists. But at least you get new, and this is like a horrible way to say this, but at least you get new ideas. And the proportional system means that they have to go through a system of compromise and coalition and actual friction, and making sure that they can convince other people. And as you see, Fiona, kind of bringing it into where are the areas that we agree on. So yes, you do see people that say that, you know, all asylum seekers should be deported in Parliament. But so far, the UK has the most extreme right immigration policy of all of those countries. When you compare them to, you know, Austria and Sweden and Italy and places where these populist right parties are in charge. So I think there's a really clear, to me, distinction between what happens when the game of power is just grabbing the levers and holding on to them for as long as you can, versus, okay, we have these set of powers and we have to make them work together.
And my disappointment, more than anything, is the way that all the parties at Westminster, well, the Labour and the Tories, have jumped on the same narrative about, you know, they've tried to outcompete in dealing with their small boats and the numbers of asylum seekers that they perceive that they have. What they haven't done, as far as I can see, is attempt to change the narrative to say, well, actually, these are the real numbers. These are the benefits of this. Here's the reason why you've got people on boats. It's because Brexit closed down routes, you know, and it's Brexit took away the ability to return people to places they'd come from, because that was what they voted to get rid of, you know.
I only recently, well, the last couple of years, I think it was, kind of twigged that in England, local authority elections are not proportional, because up here they are. I just kind of thought, oh, they must all have been, but they're not. They're still first past the post. I mean, that would be surely something that could get fixed.
Yes, and the devolution bill that just had its second reading in Parliament could have done that. It changed the voting system for mayors back to supplementary vote, which isn't proportional, but it is more proportional. We just published this paper, The Temper Trap, written by Stuart Donald, exactly about that dynamic that we were just talking about, Marlene, about this kind of myth that first past the post keeps extremists out of power. Flips that narrative on its head to say, actually, proportional representation does a better job long term dealing with the impact of extremists. And, you know, no voting system can stop a very well networked, very well financed, you know, global movement of the right, but it does shape and structures and cultures and outcomes. So we'll be continuing to push that. And as the elections bill makes its way through Parliament in the next few months, we will also be continuing to push proportional representation and work with both our grassroots, our partners in the coalition, there's lots of organisations that campaign on this, we work with them, and our colleagues in Parliament to try and push as far as we can for as many layers of government as we can, because I think, you know, the more we get rid of first past the post here, the better. You're starting to see some really funky by-election results where you have people winning on like 18% of the vote.
There's another layer to that as well, which we have come up against. There should be laws about how much, you know, can be spent, not just in the whatever the period is before the election, but donated to political parties and donated from abroad to particular people and particular parties as well. And we would include in that, actually, donations into Scottish parties from the rest of the UK, if it's for a Holyrood election. I mean, why should rich people in London be able to buy the result that they want for our parliament.
The parliamentary group that I mentioned, the APPG for Fair Elections, has 3 strands. One of them's misinformation, one of them's voting systems, and one of them's exactly that, is funding for elections.
Right.
So they have some work on that as well. And they've been working, with parliamentary colleagues who also have access to kind of the Electoral Commission and the civil service to say, okay, how do we implement a law that makes sense? The white paper for the elections bill, which gives an indication of what the government's going to put in it, was out just before parliamentary recess in the summer in July. And there are some good things in there to strengthen up party financing. I think there's some loopholes that remain open that that group is really concerned with. And I know that some Lib Dems have been doing some great campaigning on that. But Compass itself is not getting involved and putting our heft behind that. I think, as anybody knows, you have limited resources and capacity.
Yes, absolutely.
And the things we're focusing on are change the voting system and public ownership of water. Those are our 2 big campaigns right now.
Yeah. Oh, well, of course, we're sorted on that one in Scotland, but we'll put the link to Compass in the notes, because there's a lot of things that listeners might want to follow up on.
Yeah,
so
great.
I presume the website will give them that, and we'll maybe have a look at that white paper, Marlene. Marlene's favourite question: are you optimistic for democracy?
Am I optimistic?
I mean, your speech was saying reasons for optimism.
Yes, I kind of have to. But also, we're a membership organisation, and as I mentioned, run the campaigns, we do a lot of civil society work and coalition work. There are so many people in this country pushing in the right direction. They don't necessarily have the ears of the media, they don't necessarily have the levers of power, but there are so many people doing things that make a difference that never get talked about. And I have the great privilege of getting to interact with lots and lots of them. And I think that, that things may get harder, but I don't think that's a good reason to give up. And, some days it's harder and some days it's not as easy to find that. But then you go out and you talk to some of the people that are, doing like Incredible Edible, which are just planting edible foods around public lands that they already own, and like the community land movement, and we're right here, and there's so many that I can name, right? And I mentioned ERS's work, community owned renewable energy projects in Scotland, changing the conversation about who gets to make decisions about the basic things that we need for life and our future happens. It just doesn't happen at the centres of power. Is that necessarily a surprise that the British state is not the source of change and optimism? Probably not. There's this great quote: you don't have to finish the work, but you don't have to get to abandon it either.
Oh.
That's a good one.
So that's pretty much where I'm at with optimism.
I think that's really good, actually. Well, listen, I've just so enjoyed chatting to you. It's great.
Fascinating.
Thank you so much for having me
fascinating.
on. But yes, thank you so much for having me on, and please do keep involved. I want to keep Compass as involved in the Scottish political sphere and landscape as I can.
So that was interesting, wasn't it? Because Lena herself brought up Stuart Donald's paper that he's written for Compass, and it's now been published on their website. Because we've interviewed Stuart Donald before, actually. That was about, he was debugging some of the unionist arguments that you hear, the myths, debugging. But this is a bit of a different track that he's on. So he's written this article or report, which they've backed, Compass have backed. It's called The Temper Trap, which, to be honest, I think is a bit of a weird title. But anyway, the subtitle is How Proportional Representation Tames the Populist Right. And it's really, I've just skim read it so far. It's really, really good. And we're going to be talking to Stuart about this next week, we're hoping, aren't we?
It couldn't have landed better, really, in that made a nice bridge between our conversation with Lena and speaking to Stuart, because he brings much more theoretical, analytical perspective to the issue, which we just found fascinating last time.
It was great. And with this one, it's so topical. You've got 100,000 people marching in support of Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson and the others of that ilk. And we know that 16% in the polls for Holyrood's list vote next year. There's going to be Reform UK. MSPs, but it's very topical. It's very kind of pertinent to get this article written by Stuart just about how proportional representation kind of, tames the populist right. And it will do in Holyrood, but not in Westminster if they stick to first past the post.
We'll put the link to the Compass website in the notes. And if anybody wants to go and research the paper before we have Stuart on as a guest, feel free. We'll certainly be doing that so we can ask him some good questions. Look forward to continuing this discussion that Lena's started with us and see how Stuart can add to it next week.
Great.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website, and we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.